ask you to imagine. Imagine, think back, when was the first time that school became real to you? When was the first time that you were challenged? The first time that you were engaged or motivated? The first time when you experienced the joys of learning? When was the first time that you could see or begin to see the endless possibilities? When was the first time? When was the last time? Maybe you're like me and you think back to somewhere around 5th grade. I remember sitting in the car on the way home from my class in 5th grade that particular day, feeling like my life was about to be over. Neatly tucked away, secure in my bag, was a message of doom. Earlier that day, my teacher had passed back to the class our math test. And atop that test, staring back at me with menacing eyes, was the first D of my life. My first bad grade ever. You remember kindergarten, maybe first grade. Grades were simple back then. You only got S's and O's. But something happened when we added on letter grades, and I was staring face to face with my first D. I knew my life was over. I knew my parents were going to kill me. And I was thinking maybe they'll have mercy on me, because 5th grade is an awkward time in a young person's life. Puberty kind of starts. You begin to notice the girls or the guys around you. I discovered my love for sports. I discovered deodorant too. So it was a unique time in my life. I was begging for my parents to have mercy. They didn't beat me that night. They beat me plenty of times after that. But that night, my parents didn't beat me. But for the rest of that school year, I had to bring every book home every single day. And I had to sit at the dining room table and share with my parents everything my teachers had said that day, and every piece of homework, every worksheet, everything. And you know, for the rest of that school year and many years after that, I didn't have many bad grades. At least until I got to college. Or maybe like you, it happened somewhere around 9th grade. School gets real maybe around 9th grade. I remember after my 9th grade year standing in a foreign country. This place where I was standing was a far cry from my inner city neighborhood. And the things that I saw, the food that I was tasting, the places that I was going, most people on my block would never experience in their lifetime. I was on the campus of Cambridge University in England. I was studying speech and debate from world-renowned professors. And I was excited to be there because of the fun my education was giving me. And I remember that being the first time in my life where I felt like I was smart enough. Because only a handful of kids from around the country got picked for this program, and I was one of them. I remember when the application came in, the teacher at my little Adventist 3-room school made me fill it out. She said, "You can do this." And when no one else in my class dared fill out the application with me, I did it anyway. And I found myself in England. School became real to me. Maybe it was graduate school. And my teacher, Dr. Stain. You're giggling because you know Dr. Stain. And in her gently persistent way, she looks at me and says, "It's time for you to start teaching." And I'm scared because I barely made my way through undergrad. And she hands me a book and she hands me a syllabus and said, "It's time for you to get started." I remember the subtitle in the book because it's the same subtitle in the book that I use today, Communicating with Credibility and Confidence. Zero confidence at this time. And I felt like I had zero credibility. I was scared. How would I live up to the great teachers that I'd had in my lifetime? How could I live up to the Dr. Caesars? How could I live up to the Shelley Bradfields? How could I live up to the Bev Matikos? How could I live up to the Dr. Staines? And you know, no one told me that I did not have to live up to them. No one told me that the only person I had to live up to was me. So I spent maybe the first phase of my teaching life trying to be somebody that I was not. This is what I like to call the content-centered phase of my teaching. Some of you maybe have content-centered teachers today. In a content-centered classroom, the textbook is king. Or if you don't have a textbook, they tell you to go to the bookstore and you realize that your syllabus is 622 pages. Content is king in this classroom. No filter from my life, no filter from my personal experience. Only what the book says, that's what I wanted my students to regurgitate to me. I wanted them to give speeches the way that I gave speeches. I didn't ask them to think. I didn't ask them to imagine. I didn't ask them to do more. I stuck with the book, and it was not too long before I got bored as a teacher. I hated coming to class every day. I hated staring students in the face who I know hadn't read and made up answers as we went along. I hated that process. So I switched. I moved to the second phase of my teaching, which I like to call the student-centered phase. And I realized that about this time, I was getting a lot of academic probation students in my class. Maybe some of you here have been on academic probation. I knew academic probation students because I was an academic probation student. It wasn't because I had mental challenges or I had trouble learning. Not at all. Sometimes we forget that research tells us that success in college is only about 35% academic intelligence. There were other things going on in my life, my home life, what my parents were doing, my parents' socioeconomic status, my own emotions, my own social life, my own spirituality. It was all coalescing into this place, and it threw me off kilter in the classroom. Because when you break up with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, you don't really care what the teacher has to say. When your family is struggling to keep you in college and borrowing rides just to get to work, you don't really care what your teacher has to say. When for the most of your life, people have looked at you and said that you won't be anything, when the teacher looks you in the eye and says you can make it, you don't really believe them. You don't really care what they have to say. I understood academic probation students. So I developed a complex that most of us develop in our classrooms. I wanted to be their savior. I wanted to rescue them from the academic cruelties that they had experienced in their life. I wanted to be the teacher that you see on movies like Lean on Me and Great Debaters. I wanted to be that guy. So I turned my classroom into a virtual playhouse. It was a fun zone. I threw the book away, I threw the syllabus away. We would throw the tables around and sit, and we would just talk for hours and hours and hours and hours. And you would ask my students, what did you learn after 50 minutes? I don't know, but we sure had a good time. And I enjoyed it, but I realized that I was shortchanging my students. It can't be all fun and games. So I shifted again to what I consider, this is the phase of my teaching which I've been in for a couple years, and I want to stay here for a long time, the me-centered phase of teaching. And when I think about my life, I like academics, I like reading, I like lectures, I like the classics and literature, I like projects, I like working on things and solving problems, but that's not completely who I am. And when I think about myself, I like to play games, and I like to have fun, and I like to tear through the house with my children and make everybody feel good about themselves, but that's not completely who I am. And I realized that in order for me to be successful as a teacher, I needed to bring all the phases of who I was together. Around this time, I learned about learning styles. And I learned that I was a visual, an auditory, and a kinesthetic learner. I learned that I had problems in class, not because I couldn't sit still, but because my learning style tended towards movement. So I thought about this. If I'm a visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learner, what about my students? Maybe they're that way too. So I realized that you have to change the way that you do PowerPoint for your visual learners. You can't put 657 words on a slide and expect them to read it. Sometimes in the middle of writing your subject matter on the board, sometimes you got to draw little pictures and doodles and squiggles and diagrams because their brains get going when they see things happen. I realized that I had to change the inflections in my voice for my auditory students. And when students fall asleep in class, maybe it's not because they don't like you. Maybe, teachers, it's because you've used the same monotonous voice for 47 minutes and they can't take it anymore. I knew from my kinesthetic students that we had to get up and move at least once in the class period. And for those of you who are kinesthetic learners, you got about 5 minutes before I lose you. And I realized that I started to bring all of these things together, and I realized that I was starting really to engage students more. There was no one way to teach. There was no one way to do this thing. But the best way for me to do it was through the filter of my life. Been teaching since 2005. Wow. And I learned some lessons on the way that I'm going to share with you. For those of you who are teachers, for those of you who are students, for those of you who are alive, all of you can learn something from these lessons, from my teaching experience. The first lesson I learned was setting the tone early. This isn't just for school, this is for your life. In your life, set the tone early. I remember reading in my wife's elementary education book, and the scholar said, do everything on the first day of class that you hope to do for the rest of the semester. And you know how we as higher education professionals are. That won't work in a higher education classroom. That's kids' stuff. But I tried it, and it worked. That's why when you come into my class, the first day of class, I make you give a speech. That's why on the first day of class, I make you work in groups. That's why on the first day of class, I make you have one-on-one conversations. That's why on the first day of class, I make you create your own visual aids so you know and you're engaged in what we're going to do for the rest of the semester, and there are no surprises. Set the tone early. But you should also keep your students guessing. I cringe at the professor that doesn't at least change the color of their binder from year to year. I caution against professors like these because this is what happens at the beginning of every school year. Students pass their notes from one friend to the other. And if you don't change your notes, if you don't change your assignments, if you don't even change the days that you will skip class, your students will come into your class thinking that they know you. And they'll never pay attention to you because they have your notes. And if I have your notes, then what good are you? There will be some days in my class, no warning, I just wouldn't show up. Just wouldn't show up. Nothing was wrong with me. I wasn't sick, but I wanted to keep my students on their toes so that they never knew what to expect from me. I kept them guessing. The third thing was really hard. I had to admit that I didn't know some things. When I first started teaching, you know how we are. We're so optimistic. We say, when a student asks us a question that we don't know, we make up an answer. It sounds academic-ish. It sounds smart, but it's made up on the spot. Now, I remember the first time I was in a class and a student asked me a question, and I said I didn't know. And time didn't stop. The world did not end. Life continued, and I actually went home that night, researched and found the answer and brought it back to the student in the next class period. Show your students that you're still engaged in the learning process. It doesn't matter if you're the foremost expert on what you're teaching, you will never exhaust the knowledge of your discipline. There will always be some things that you don't know. Lesson 4 is save your victories. In life, save your victories. Write down when you've made a good decision. Write down when things have gone well for you. Write down, teachers, when you taught a lesson that was simply amazing and mind-boggling. Write down when your hands-on activity went extremely well. Write them down. Why? Because there will come a day where your lecture fails. There'll come a day where you'll bomb. There'll come a day when you don't know what you're doing, and you'll wake up and look in the mirror and say, why am I teaching in the first place? Save your victories. You'll need them for later. And finally, look in the mirror. Be prepared to look in the mirror. You will see yourself in your students. And sometimes we're scared at the reflection. The student that you have in class that likes to cut up and make noise and draw attention from your lecture, engage that student the most. Show them that they're loved and valued and accepted, and give them a place, give them a job to do in the classroom. That student that maybe they're an honor student and thinks they're smarter than everybody else. The student that really hates being in your general education class and can't figure out why everybody else can't keep up. Challenge that student the most. Make them see that being in your class is worthwhile. Put them in charge of something. Stretch their knowledge. Let them know that you haven't wasted their time. And the shy student that likes to slide in and always sit in the back of the classroom and puts their head down when you ask a question, inspire that student the most. I remember teaching one semester, and we write down our goals at the beginning of the school year. What do you want to accomplish in communication class? And I remember one student saying to me, I want the courage to ask this girl out on a date. And I remember going through the semester and laboring with him, and him cringing when I would call on him, and him cowering when I would ask him to come up front and do his speeches. I remember him saying to me after every class period, Mr. Quinn, I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it. And I remember ignoring him saying that and saying that, yes, you can. And somewhere before the end of the semester, he reported back to me, not only have I developed, Mr. Quinn, the confidence to ask that girl out on a date, that girl is now my girlfriend. Now, it may not be a big thing to you, but in the trenches of the classroom, watching a student that you have labored with, this was a big deal. And that's why I do what I do. I'll leave you with this quote from Parker J. Palmer. He says, good teaching comes from the identity and the integrity of the teacher. It's not about technique. It's not about what everybody else has done before you. Good teaching comes from the identity and integrity of the teacher. Figure out who you are. Whatever journey that you need to go on to figure out who you are, do it. Whatever building block or part of your personal history is missing, find it. And figure out who you are. And once you figure out who you are, stay true to who you are. It's no fun in life walking around pretending to be someone that you're not. And once you figure out who you are and you start staying true to who you are, before you teach, before you lecture, before you lead, before you pastor, before you guide, whatever information you're controlling, make sure that it first passes through your life and your experiences before you dare share it with anyone else. Thank you.